Welcome to MyShlaich Story Hour Chassidim series.
All right, Lachluchis, we left off. There is a great debate taking place between the Alter Rebbe and three great scholars of the Misnagdim. This debate was actually secretly arranged by the Alter Rebbe because the Alter Rebbe wanted to put a stop to the Lashon Hara and the Rechilus and the Meitzi Shemra and the Bilbulim that the Misnagdim were slandering against Chassidim, not only against the Alter Rebbe, but against all the Talmidei HaMagid. And so the Alter Rebbe sent out 20 Talmidei Chachamim, 20 Chassidim to go around and become Magidim, to go around and talk in different towns and to help the people better themselves in their Avodas Hashem, and to suggest to them that since there is a machlekes between the Chassidim and the Misnagdim, perhaps there should be a debate between the leaders of the Chassidim and the Misnagdim, and everybody be able to decide who's who. So the Misnagdim said, this is a great idea. You know what? Let's have the debate. We'll wipe the floor with the Chassidim. They're a bunch of Amaratzim. They don't learn Torah. They wouldn't know Gemara. They wouldn't know Mishnayos. They wouldn't know Shulchan Aruch. However, the leaders of the Misnagdim, the Rabbanim, realized, the Alter Rebbe is no joke. We don't necessarily want this debate. However, the Vilna Gaon said, if the people are asking for it, you must do it. And the debate was arranged. We said yesterday the rules were that the Misnagdim would pose questions to the Alter Rebbe in Gemara. The Alter Rebbe would first have to answer that before the Alter Rebbe could explain and defend Teres Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe said, no problem. After he answers their questions, he would pose them a question. And so it was agreed. 3 against 1. 3 of the biggest Talmidei Chachamim of the Misnagdim put together their hardest shilas in Gemara to present to the Alter Rebbe in a packed shul where people from all over Russia came to participate and watch this debate take place. And as you can very well imagine, the Alter Rebbe answered all those questions with ease and with such simplicity, while the questions that the Alter Rebbe posed to the Misnagdim, they were not able to answer even one of them. We say this story and continue this story because this would be one of the deciding factors that will shape Reb Pinchos Raizes' decision to decide to become a Chosid of the Alter Rebbe. We left off yesterday that the Misnagdim went home to try to find an answer to the Alter Rebbe's 3 questions and returned the next day to the debate with an answer. The next day, the Beis HaMedrash was even more packed than the day before. It was overflowing. People were squished, hanging from the rafters, squeezing their heads in from the windows, trying to hear the debate inside. Everybody wanted to hear how these Misnagdishe Rabbanim would answer the 3 very difficult questions from the Alter Rebbe. As all the scholars who had attended the debate had tried their best to answer them, but nobody was able to. The 3 Misnagdishe Rabbanim had reviewed the questions the entire night and early in the morning, but the questions were too hard and were not able to come up with an appropriate and adequate satisfactory answer. At that time, the Bezdin of Minsk declared that they were satisfied that the Alter Rebbe was indeed a big Talmid Chacham. Shkoyach. Now, they would proceed to the second part of the debate. The Alter Rebbe would now have to defend the innovations of Chassidim and Chassidis. The answers to the 3 questions they announced would be given at a later time, when the 3 very big Talmidei Chacham of the Misnagdim had more time to do research, look up an answer to the Alter Rebbe. So basically, they just tried to kick the can down the road and pass the buck up until a later date. The Alter Rebbe will pause, we'll get to your answers later, we need more time to research. Hagam, the Alter Rebbe answered all the questions right away without having to open a sefer, but that's no surprise to us as Chassidim, knowing the Greiskeit and the Ge'enos of the Alter Rebbe. Now it was time for the Alter Rebbe to explain and defend Chassidus to them. However, the Alter Rebbe stood up and objected, saying, no, we agreed that before we begin the second part of the debate, my questions would be answered. Those were the rules. 18 years ago, when I first came to my master and teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, I asked him these same 3 questions. And without hesitating for a moment, the Alter Rebbe says, the Mezrich Maggid answered all of them. The Alter Rebbe then repeated the answers that the Mezritcher Maggid told him at great length, explaining them in such a clear and simple way that everybody in the packed crowd in the Beis Medrash in Minsk were astounded. He then took the opportunity to explain the basic philosophies of Chassidus. One of his debaters and the majority of the Beis Din of Minsk announced that Chassidus was against the way of the Torah, and they used the Alter Rebbe's refusal to continue the debate as the basis for their decision. Well, no kidding, they broke the rules. The Alter Rebbe doesn't have to go now and follow their rules, but when they saw that there was no way out of it, they decided to use this as a way to show, you see, the Alter Rebbe doesn't have an answer for Chassidus, so therefore the Alter Rebbe doesn't want to continue the debate in the way they want to. However, many of the elders who were present, although remaining opposed to Chassidus, they didn't become Chassidim, felt that the Beis Din had been too rash in their decision. The Goyen Reb Zemmel, who was another one of the debaters, was also of the opinion that the Beis Din was too harsh in their decision. When he mentioned his feelings to the Goyen Reb Chanei Chenech, who was the father of Reb Hillel Paritcher, Reb Chanei Chenech agreed with him. And you know what he told him? He said, my son Reb Pinchas informed me that he has decided to become a chassid. In addition to Reb Pinchos Raizes, another person, Reb Yitzchak Isaac of Vitebsk, who was the nephew of Reb Zemmel, also went to Liazne, and another 60 young Talmidei Chachamim became Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. Many more of those who had attended the debate stopped bothering the Chassidim and developed a great respect for the Alter Rebbe. So in short, what brought Reb Pinchos Raizes to Chassidus? It was 3 meetings with the Alter Rebbe. The first one cold winter night in Cheshvan. The second one was hearing the niggin of the Alter Rebbe. And the third one was when the Alter Rebbe came to debate the Misnagdim. The Alter Rebbe showed the Ge'enos of Chassidim and the basic Yosedis of Chassidus Chabad. I just want to add one more note, Kindalach. When the Mishnah says, Lo Yama Aretz Chassid, in order to properly understand Chassidus, we also have to learn Gemara. You also have to learn Shulchan Aruch. You also have to learn Mishnayos. So don't come to class and say, I'm only going to learn Chassidus. I'm going to learn Tanya Bapeh. I'm going to learn a Maimer. I'm going to learn a Sikha. That's what's important. It's also important. But if you want to understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying, if you want to understand what the Rebbe is saying and look at the Sikhas, or if you want the Maimer to be a different Maimer, you have to kennen the Gemara, you have to kennen the Midrashim, you have to kennen the Tanakh, the Psukim that it's talking about. You have to know the background of what the Alter Rebbe and what the Rabbeim are explaining in the Maimarim. The fact that the Alter Rebbe was going around to have a debate and to show them the Chassidim kennen Eich Lernen wasn't the Chas v'Shalom show off. But in order to know Chassidus, you have to know Nigla. And this was like the final straw that brought Reb Pinchos Raizes to Chabad to become one of the greatest Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, to the extent, like we said, the Mittler Rebbe referred to him as the general of Chassidim. And now let's go back in the Lach to the story of the debate. Reb Pinchos Raizes, or at that time was known as Reb Pinchos Shik, was present at the debate, and by the time Reb Pinchos arrived home in Shklov, everybody had already heard the outcome of the debate. So Reb Pinchos was certain that his decision to become a chassid, because it wasn't something that he settled on yet 100%, but he was, going towards it, he was certain that everybody would accept it without making a machlekes about it. But Kindalach, not only was his decision accepted, what happened actually exceeded even his greatest expectations. Because you know what happened? His shviger, the mother of his wife, his mother-in-law, whose name was Razel, she was very, very wealthy. Not only was Reb Pinchos Raizes' shviger very wealthy, she was also a very big balas tzedakah. She gave a lot of money to tzedakah, and she was a very big Yireh Shamayim. And for years, she had heard only bad things about the Chassidim. They call them the kat, the cult, so to say. They do things differently. They follow their leader. And she believed it, like everybody else in the Misnagdishe towns believed everything that they were being told. Now, she heard how the Alter Rebbe had won the debate and what kind of a Talmid Chacham and a big tzaddik the Alter Rebbe is. She told her sons-in-law that even though until now we were against the Chassidim, And from what I understand, she probably didn't have any sons because the story only makes reference to her sons-in-law. And she said, it's true, we only heard negative things about the Chassidim. And until now, we didn't like the Chassidim. But now we see that the Maggid of Liazna is a real special person. She told her 3 sons-in-law that I see I was taka mistaken. And I decided that I will give my entire fortune, all my money, to the one of you that will go to Liazna and become a Talmud of the Maggid of Liazna. So Kinderlach, Reb Pinchos Raizes was worried about not making Machleikis by making a decision to become a Chosid. Not only was it not a problem, Kinderlach, it helped him. Because the Shviger said, go and I'm going to give you all the money that I have. Now Reb Pinchos had already told his father about it, but he didn't yet accept the idea. And also Reb Pinchos wanted to discuss it first with his wife. Now Reb Pinchos sees that the family is on board. No problem. He was ready to go, pack his bags, and head towards Liazna. And a short time later, Reb Pinchos' brother-in-law, Reb Zalman, also joined him. So Reb Pinchos packed the bag and set out right away for Liazna. And for the next 5 months, he would sit and learn with the brothers of the Alter Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim, because the Alter Rebbe wasn't in Liazna at the time. The Alter Rebbe was still traveling around in different cities. And finally, when the Alter Rebbe arrived back in Liazna, after Reb Pinchos was thoroughly tested on everything that he learned, he was accepted into the second cheder, the second class. Kinderlach, the way it worked in those days was there were 3 classes of Chassidim, of Talmidim. And the Talmidim of the Alter Rebbe were very, very, very big Talmidei Chachamim. To get into the 3rd class, you had to know the whole Shas and the Rambam. And to get into the 2nd class, on top of that, you had to know other Mefarshim, and other Poskim. Only like real special Chassidim, maybe like Binyamin Kletzker and others, were allowed to go into the 1st class. Finally, Kinderlach, after 8 months, Reb Pinchos Raizes left Shklov, returning home. He brought with him home a zettel, a note from the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe wrote that he had studied with him personally. The Alter Rebbe was a chavrusa with Reb Pinchos Raizes for 3 months. And when he presented that note to his shviger, Reb Pinchos Raizes' mother-in-law gave him all her money. She was a very wealthy woman. So in just one moment, Reb Pinchos became a very wealthy man. However, Kinderlach, Reb Pinchos, being that he was a big Talmid Chacham, and he knew that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says that you shouldn't use Torah for your own gain in order to become wealthy, Reb Pinchos took all the money, packed it up in a big box, and brought it with him to the Alter Rebbe, gave it to the Alter Rebbe for the Alter Rebbe to do as he sees fit. We're going to talk about that in more details in another story. The Alter Rebbe benched Reb Pinchos with a bracha that he should be a gvir, he should have a lot of money, and that he should have success in his limud Torah. And Chassidim also say that Reb Pinchos asked the Alter Rebbe for a 3rd bracha. It is believed that he asked the Alter Rebbe for a bracha for children, which the Alter Rebbe did not answer him. Kinderlach, we touched upon this earlier. It definitely would have been more prestigious, more choshev for Reb Pinchos to be called by his father's last name. Chanech Henich Shik. His father was the Rav of the city of Shklov. He was the chief rabbi. And he was a big guy, and he was Nishkin Pash the Mensch. However, listen to this. In view of the fact that it was his shviger, Reizel, who encouraged him to become a chassid, from then on, Reb Pinchos was known by Chassidim as Reb Pinchos Raizes. Reb Pinchos that belongs to Reizel, his mother-in-law, because it's thanks to his mother-in-law Reizel, to his shviger Reizel, that Reb Pinchos became a chassid. So now, next time you hear the name Reb Pinchos Raizes, you'll know that this was a chassid that came to the Alter Rebbe in a very unique way. He was encouraged by his shviger. How many people do you know that their shviger, their mother-in-law, encouraged them to take on a whole new derech and aveda? It's not very common. There was one time, and this is a little bit off topic, but I think it ties in to the uniqueness of Reb Pinchos Raizes. There were Chassidim of Reb Aaron Kaliner. There was a Talmud of the Maggid. They were secret Chassidim. And one time, Reb Aaron Kaliner was coming to a certain town, and these secret Kaliner Chassidim wanted to do something special for him. And so they decided that they're going to warm up the mikveh. How are they going to warm up the mikveh? The mikveh they had in those days in that town was a well. It was freezing cold in the well. So the Chassidim of Reb Aaron Kaliner, they took boiling hot buckets of water and they poured it into the well to warm up the well, to mix the warm water with the cold water. This way, when Reb Aaron Kaliner goes to the mikveh, it'll be warm. However, they didn't know that while they were pouring in the water, there was a Chosid, a Lubavitcher Chosid, a Chabad Chosid that was toiveling. And they poured the water on his head, and Rahman al-Islan, he passed away. And now the secret Kaliner Chassidim were in trouble. They were afraid that some Alamershans, they would be caught that they were Chassidim, secret Chassidim, because they were married to Misnagdishe families. They didn't want to upset their shviger, they didn't want to upset their shver, they didn't want to upset their wife or anybody else in the mishpacha, so they had to be secret Chassidim. And the guy died because he got hot water poured on his head while he was in the mikveh. So they took him and they brought him to the house where Reb Aaron Kaliner was staying. And Reb Aaron Kaliner came to the room and he did whatever a Rebbe has to do to bring someone's neshama back into his guf. And the chassid wakes up and they're looking at each other and they're having this like silent conversation without saying any words. And Reb Aaron Kaliner is basically looking at the chassid and he's saying, I brought you back to life. I did Tchias HaMesim. Now you belong to me. You have to become my chassid. And finally, after having this conversation back and forth without any words, the Lubavitcher chassid, the Chabad chassid, calls out, Tchias HaMesim kennst du. You can do Tchias HaMesim. Big deal. Oh, but a Rebbe is not einer. There's only one Rebbe. I have one Rebbe, and that's the Alter Rebbe. And with that, the chassid got up and he ran out of the room. It's true, the Baran Kaliner is the Heilige Mensch. You can do Tchias HaMesim. But I am a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. My Rebbe, a Rebbe is not einer. There's only one Rebbe. I say the story to bring out the first part that the whole secret operation to pour hot water in the mikveh is because they were secret Chassidim. It was very uncommon. Remember, the Chassidim were not very popular in those days. So you had a lot of Chassidim that married Misnagdishe families. And you know, Kindalach, that in the last 75 or 50 years, did Lubavitchers begin to marry only Lubavitchers for the most part. But if you go back 75 years ago, 80 years ago, you'll find a lot of Chassidim, the Lubavitcher Chassidim, that are marrying other types of Chassidim that are not Lubavitcher Chassidim. And here you have, in our story, the Pinchos Raizes, who was himself not a Chabad Chosid, or not a Chosid Bichlal, and who married someone who wasn't a Chosid, and it was his shviger that encouraged him to become a Chosid. Not only did she encourage him to become a Chosid, she actually made that he wouldn't have to worry about anything else because she gave him all her wealth. She was a very wealthy lady. And because of that, we call him Reb Pinchos Raizes.